He was young, barely 21, small, polite, fluent in Spanish, and feared across the New Mexico territory. To others, a symbol of resistance in a violent and unfair world. But Billy the Kid's story is not just the tale of an outlaw. It is the story of a nation expanding westward, a United States transforming rapidly, often brutally, and a frontier society where poverty, politics, and power shaped the lives of everyone who lived there. But behind the myths, who was he really? Today, we uncover the true, documented life of one of America's most iconic outlaws. Billy the Kid entered the world as Henry McCarty, likely in 1859, in New York City, at a time when the United States was swelling with immigrants. 5 million newcomers arrived in the mid-19th century, many fleeing poverty or famine. His mother, Catherine McCarty, was an Irish immigrant, most likely from County Antrim. His father remains unknown. Even his exact birth date is lost. But the East Coast offered few opportunities for poor immigrant families. Like thousands of others, the McCartys joined the Great Migration westward, traveling through Indiana, Kansas, Colorado, and finally, New Mexico territory. The frontier was changing fast. The US had taken New Mexico from Mexico only a decade earlier, in 1848. The region was a mix of Anglo settlers, long-established Hispanic families, and native nations like the Apache and Navajo, who were being displaced and forced into conflict. This was the world Henry grew up in, violent, unstable, but full of possibility. In 1874, tragedy struck. His mother died of tuberculosis in New Mexico. Henry was just 14, and suddenly alone in a territory where law and opportunity often belonged only to the powerful. Without his mother, Henry drifted between boarding houses and ranch jobs. Poverty, not malice, pushed him into crime. In 1875, he was arrested for stealing clothes, a common crime among destitute teenagers. He escaped from jail, beginning a pattern that would follow him for the rest of his life. At this time, the American Southwest was a chaotic frontier. The Civil War had ended only a decade earlier. Reconstruction politics still shaped national debates. Railroads were expanding, cattle herds were growing, and the US Army clashed constantly with indigenous nations. Amid this instability, Henry, now using names like Kid Antrim and later William H. Bonney, slipped into the margins of society. His first confirmed killing happened in 1877, when he was about 17 years old, shooting Frank Windy Cahill after being slammed into a bar floor during a drunken fight. Likely self-defense, the case would probably have been ruled justifiable homicide, but in the frontier, courts offered little protection. Fearing retaliation, Henry fled, beginning his life as a fugitive. By the late 1870s, New Mexico territory was a place where law meant influence, not justice. Economically, the region was dominated by a handful of powerful businessmen aligned with local politicians and the territorial government. In Lincoln County, that power belonged to Lawrence Murphy and James Dolan, who controlled a monopoly on goods, money, and political connections. Against them stood a new arrival, John Tunstall, an English rancher supported by attorney Alexander McSween. They challenged the monopoly, threatening decades of economic control. The stage was set not just for a feud, but for a miniature civil war. Billy the Kid entered this world as a ranch hand working for Tunstall. He wasn't yet a gunfighter. He was simply a young cowboy caught in the crossfire of powerful men. On the 18th of February 1878, John Tunstall was murdered by a posse, loyal to Murphy and Dolan. This killing ignited the Lincoln County War, a violent struggle fueled by economic monopoly, political corruption, and frontier justice. Billy and several young cowboys formed a vigilante unit called the Regulators. They believed they were enforcing justice, but in reality, both sides acted outside the law. Billy participated in several violent confrontations, including the ambush of Sheriff William Brady, the deadly fight with Buckshot Roberts, and the 5-day battle in Lincoln, where homes burned and dozens died. Across the US, the federal government was trying to impose order in Western territories. But New Mexico was effectively ruled by local alliances, the perfect environment for an outlaw legend to rise. By 1878's end, the Murphy-Dolan faction had won. The regulators were disbanded, and Billy was now deeply entangled in multiple murder charges. With no faction left to protect him, Billy became a fugitive. But this wasn't the romantic outlaw life later films created. New Mexico Territory in the 1880s was one of the poorest, most violent areas under US control. Outlaws, indigenous raids, corrupt sheriffs, and cattle rustling were everyday realities. Billy survived by rustling cattle and horses, gambling, doing ranch work, and relying on the support of Hispanic communities. He spoke fluent Spanish, danced at local fiestas, and often lived in homes where he was treated as part of the family. To many locals, he wasn't a villain. He was a young man resisting a corrupt system. Meanwhile, American newspapers back east were hungry for frontier drama. They exaggerated his exploits, turning Billy the Kid into a national sensation. Historically, between 4 and 8 killings can be confirmed, occurring mostly during the Lincoln County War of 1878 and later as a fugitive in 1880, usually in the context of revenge, self-defense, or escaping capture. In 1880, ranchers and territorial politicians pushed for a crackdown on crime. They wanted stability as railroads approached New Mexico, and the frontier era began to fade. They chose Pat Garrett as sheriff. Tall, ambitious, and publicity-savvy, Garrett saw Billy as the perfect outlaw to bring down. Billy was captured in December 1880, tried, and sentenced to hang for killing Sheriff Brady during the war. But Billy wasn't done. On the 28th of April 1881, he pulled off one of the most dramatic escapes in Western history. Slipping out of his shackles, killing Deputy James Bell, taking a shotgun and killing Deputy Bob Ollinger, and riding out of Lincoln in broad daylight. The story spread across the country. To the Eastern press, Billy the Kid became a symbol of the untamable West. The frontier was closing. The US wanted New Mexico to become a stable, governable territory. Outlaws no longer fit the image of the modernizing West. After 3 months on the run following his daring April escape, Billy the Kid had become the most wanted man in the territory, moving constantly between safe houses and relying on friends in Hispanic communities. Sheriff Pat Garrett, determined to capture him and bring closure to his case, had tracked Billy's movements for weeks. On the 14th of July 1881, Garrett had learned that Billy was hiding at the home of Pete Maxwell in Fort Sumner, a small settlement where Billy had friends and former allies from the Lincoln County War. Acting on this information, Garrett arrived at night, quietly entering the house to catch him by surprise. Billy, unaware that Garrett was inside, moved through the dark bedroom. When he asked, "Quién es?" "Who is it?" Garrett, aiming to prevent another escape, fired a single shot. Billy was killed instantly. His life ended at about 21 years old, not on the gallows as planned, but in the quiet darkness of a frontier bedroom, a final act in a violent, short life that had already become legend. Billy was then buried in Fort Sumner Cemetery, in a simple grave handled by local friends and residents. There was no formal ceremony, and the grave was initially unmarked, reflecting the life of a young man who had lived fast, violent, and outside the law. Today, a small memorial and marker honor his resting place, though the exact spot is debated by historians. The frontier had claimed another life, but the story of Billy the Kid would never be forgotten. Billy the Kid lived a short, violent life, but not an unusual one for the frontier. What made him immortal was the powerful combination of myth, media, and mystery. Newspapers exaggerated his kills. Folktales painted him as both villain and hero, and decades later, novels and Hollywood films transformed him into a symbol of the American West. Even today, debates continue. Was he a ruthless outlaw, or a young man shaped by poverty, injustice, and a violent territory? What's certain is that Billy the Kid, Henry McCarty, remains one of the most enduring figures of the Old West. A legend born from a boy who never lived long enough to escape it.